Hello, welcome to a observational drawing of a Buzz Lightyear toy. I set up one of my old action figures. Well, he's a big toy actually, but I set it up on my desk and played around with different compositions. But I settled on this one of having him at a 3/4 angle, and I want to do a pen observational drawing of him that's about an hour long. And to start with, before I get into using the pen, I just wanted to establish the big shapes of his overall form, and to then work into that with the pen. But first, just trying to map out proportion and these. So this starting part now is entirely just looking at the shapes, where I'm just doing squares and rectangles and circles. So all the joints, as you can see in the reference photo, the joints on Buzz are fantastic because they're these large spheres that you can then imagine, or you can draw over into your other shapes and have them overlap, and then use those as references to I'm constantly cross-referencing everything to make sure that I'm getting the right proportion and keeping everything in line with one another. I don't want one arm to be bigger than another or his torso too wide. So I'm checking those back and forth between the reference. So I'm mostly looking at the reference. So I spend about 50%, maybe 60% of my time looking at the actual toy, and then 40% looking at the drawing that I'm making, just to make sure that I'm keeping everything in line. I find that if I spend my time looking at the drawing, I just get absorbed in the details. So initially, ignore every detail that's on it. He's got lots of buttons and other nice little decals to him that I want to get in at this point now. But when I'm initially mapping things out, those things are irrelevant. I'm just looking at the overall silhouette and then working into those big shapes and defining them out gradually. So it's working big to small and then going into the environment. So I've put the base that he's standing on, as well as the cast shadow. And once I've got all of that set up, I then go in and start dimensioning out the face. And that takes a little bit more time. The face is important to get right, and it's a little bit more difficult to make it accurate and make it feel like the character. I had a little bit of trouble getting it to, I'm not sure, it was a little bit off every time I drew it, but I'm not too worried about that now. I can keep working on the rest of it and gradually build it all up. I think that working one part in isolation isn't a good way to go. It's ideal to build it all up at the same time, so you're getting a gradual escalation of detail, so that you're able to reference that against one another and have the proper context when you're drawing it, rather than just getting absorbed in one part, and then you'll get burnt out by the end of it. So lots of using the kneadable eraser, rubbing away areas and working back into them and building them up gradually. I think I'm starting to get happy with his expression, but it's still not quite right. For the purposes of this study, I think it was working out okay. But the main concern is always just the overall proportions and getting those shapes to match with the reference. So again, spending most of your time looking at the reference, then going back to your drawing, and then building in all of these nice little details that he has once I've got everything laid out. So I'm just using an HB pencil here. You could probably use a 2H at the start, and then working with an HB and a 2B once you've established all of the construction. So it's starting to get there with the overall setup of Buzz now established. Can start looking at erasing these lines. So I'm using all of this as construction line that I'm going to go back over now and really detail out so that when I go in with pen, there's no doubt as to where things go. The process really is about just the first couple of steps being the most important in getting the proportions right, because if you just work away at your drawing and go straight into details, you're likely to end up with something that isn't in proportion, and then you'll have to go back in and change it. And with pen, that becomes very difficult. There are things that you can do, but it's better if you can just get it right in the first go with the pen. But with the pencil, you can just keep going back in. There's nothing stopping me from just keep working with the pen, drawing and redrawing. I sometimes get it right the first time. More often than not, I don't. So it means that there's lots of draw overs. And taking a break from the piece is the best way to see if you've made a mistake or if there's an error with the proportions. So here I'm going in with a 2B pencil and trying to work out those forms and correct any little mistakes, because I took a 30-minute break and I came back to it, and I was able to now see where some of the errors were, maybe where some of the shapes were a little bit distorted or bloated and weren't in the proper perspective. So you don't have to do it all in one session. It's preferable if you don't, because your eye gets so used to seeing one thing and you're not actually seeing the inconsistencies or the parts that don't line up to the reference. And I've found that one of the best things to do when you've reached that point of not being able to completely assess accurately what you're working on, you either send it to somebody else and get honest feedback from them, somebody that you trust that you know won't just say that they like it. It's getting feedback is important, particularly if you're able to get honest and accurate feedback. And then the best feedback that I've been able to get on this sort of stuff is from my phone, and to take a photo of it and then to flip it. And if you're working in Photoshop, you can just flip the canvas in that. But it helps to reset your perception of the piece, so that you've changed the way that you're viewing it, so it feels like you're viewing it for the first time again. So you can start to accurately compare it to your reference and determine which parts are not lining up accurately. Maybe you've got him a little bit lopsided, or something like his left arm's a little bit bigger than his right. There are lots and lots of little details and areas that can go wrong. So it's not about trying to get everything perfect. It's just trying to make it as good as I can. And yeah, that takes time and effort. But he's looking pretty close, and I was happy at this point to go in with pen. And the initial stage of working with pen, there's no right way to start. It's just getting started with whatever you're happy with. And I felt like mapping out the legs and getting the forms established, and I'm trying to cross hatch only a little bit at the start. So I'm just putting in one direction of cross hatching, of following the form, of arcing around his boots, where they have a nice rounded contour to them. So I'm trying to follow that with the lines that I'm making. So I think at this point I probably got a bit too focused on doing the legs. So I split my attention to the other leg and working consistently across them. I want the same type of cross hatching to be present across the whole piece. I'm trying to use the same technique throughout, of following the contour and then going back over the top of it with another direction of lines to show that area is in shadow. So there's the shadow that forms just from the shape of the object turning, but there's also the shadow, like at his bottom left leg, he has a cast shadow on his leg as well. So I was doing some vertical lines. And I'm really trying to squint and focus on the areas of the reference that I see cast shadows, that I see the darkest light, the darkest areas. And they were predominantly on the right side of the object. So working in gradual steps of building up the darkest parts and then going back in now and doing some of those medium shadows. But the first step is always whenever I get to a new area, is to define out the edge of the shape and then fill it in with some just vertical or either vertical lines for the shadow or doing lines that follow the contour of the object. And mostly, if you just do lines that follow the contour of the object, you'll get something that looks pretty convincing and also articulates the forms really nicely. So yeah, still going around and working bits and working in the areas that I've started on and gradually bringing them up to the same level of rendered the same level of quality. I'm trying to work gradually throughout the areas that I don't want to just build up one place at a time. I want to build up the areas that I've started and to hopefully get to the point where I've got most of it laid out. I've got most of the outline of things done, and then I can just start focusing on the light and dark. That's really I'm just doing an observational drawing based on light. My eyes are just interpreting light, and the goal is to render that as accurately as I can with just using lines. So it's never going to look as subtle or as detailed as as a photo of it, but I can do something different. I can do an interpretation of this toy just using lines. And from doing these sorts of studies, it really helps with how you see and perceive the form in your mind, and then helping you to do that from imagination later on. And focusing on where the lightest parts are really helps to emphasize where those areas are closest to you and where you're putting most of your lines. They're the things that are furthest away, they're turning away from you and they're not getting as much light. And then you can start thinking about the different colors, and his chest plate is green, so it's darker than the rest of his chest. Like he has a white base chest plate, and then he has this green kind of interlocking component that has his buttons on it. So that's darker in value to the rest of him. So I started doing vertical lines on that. But it's the same process wherever I'm working on this drawing, is to first do the outline. So you define your edge, you create it's almost like doing a coloring in book where you create the outline and then you fill in that shape. And it becomes quite simple when you look at it like that. Once I've already got everything laid out, so I know where everything goes, but I'm still looking at the reference. I'm still looking at the toy, and I'm looking really closely, particularly at the face. I'm looking really closely at where the shadows are forming, and then I'm only putting pen in the areas where the shadows are. I don't want to put too much pen. If I put too much down, it'll start to look cluttered, and I'll start to overdraw it. And I think I might have reached that stage with the face, but I'm able to go back in later and rework some of that stuff with some other tools. But as I've been going, it's just trying to get each part gradually built up. You can see I worked his left arm a bit, and then I go back over to the right arm. I want to make sure that I don't get too absorbed in one part. I think it's not the same for everyone, but for me, it was something that I really struggled with, where I would get completely absorbed in one detail or one part of a drawing. And it takes a bit of effort, a bit of conscious effort to break that attention and then go focus on something else. So at the moment, I've just been looking at doing horizontal line strokes and then doing some vertical. So I'm trying to get that across the whole piece. Do some on the leg, do some on the other leg, finish working on him and getting his form and the shapes reading as self-contained, and but also as a whole. They're not one of them's not darker than another. It's making sense as an overall toy, trying to create that illusion of this being a 3D object on a 2D plane. So yeah, it was going pretty well at this stage. I think I had several breaks at this point where I took a step back and then would go back in and rework areas that I didn't like or that were slightly lacking. And now I've gone in with a slightly smaller pen. So this is a 0.3, and initially I was using a 0.5. It's just been really patient with it and looking at the reference a lot, comparing my drawing with the reference, seeing what areas are maybe missing some rendering, missing some hatching, and comparing them back and forth between the reference and the drawing. And then you're basically doing trying to act as like a color matcher or a printer where you're just trying to emulate. And now it's trying to establish that cast shadow that's on the surface he's standing on. And I do everything traditionally in the sense of cross-hatching, where you go in one direction, and I'm going completely in the same direction until I map out the entirety of the base that he's standing on. And then I'll go in another direction to show that I don't want it to be totally black, but I want it to be about like a 75% gray. And then creating that cast shadow that I've got a board behind him and he's leaving a cast shadow on that board. But I don't want that board to be black either. And I want to show the direction of the light. So I'm doing the lines for this cast shadow in the direction that the light's hitting him, and then casting that shadow on that board. So trying to make those lines in one stroke, that's the most important thing with all of these lines that I'm doing. I'm not doing them super quickly, but I'm not doing them slowly when I'm making each individual line. Like obviously this is really sped up, but the creation and the quality of the line is important. Like it's the entirety of the drawing. So they don't have to be perfectly straight, but making them all of equal quality is important. And here you can see I'm going in with a Posca. So I came back, this is another session, like this is I think about an hour later, and I didn't like some parts of it. I think my evaluation of it was that I had overdrawn and I wanted to bring some highlights back in, so I used a white Posca. And one of the things that I felt it was missing was him popping from the background a little bit, because some of his elements are white and the background was white. I felt that they were becoming flat, so I wanted to separate him from the background. So to do that, I'm just putting a vertical pass. I'm just doing vertical lines all over the background so that he starts to stand out from it, that the white areas on him look like highlights instead of just the white paper. So I have the background I have for it is as you saw in that initial photo for it, it's a nice mid-tone, and a lot of his components have this nice reflective quality. So making the background have some pen on it, have some value to it, will help to make him stand out a little bit more. And I felt that it really did need some more clarity in those areas where there's highlight showing. So going back into those with the Posca. You could use whiteout if you've got whiteout, but I found the Posca to work quite well for going back over the pen. You might need to do it a couple of times to make sure that you really accentuate it. And yeah, just filling in little details, working back and forth, but gradually building it up. I found it really fun to go back in and try to draw one of my favorite toys as a kid. And doing it in pen was a bit of a challenge, but give it a try. It was quite fun. Yeah. Thanks for watching. I hope that you got something out of it and it was entertaining or helpful in some way. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.